Hello, everyone. You're very welcome to this very special event to launch Brunel's Big Read for 2025 in conjunction with the Nero Book Awards. My name is Helen Cullen, and I'm a novelist and a reader in creative writing at Brunel University of London. Brunel University is a very proud sponsor of the Nero Book Awards, and so to celebrate our collaboration, last year we launched the very first ever Brunel's Big Read. The Big Read involves students and faculty from all across the campus voting to decide which of the Nero Book Awards category winners will become our Big Read in the following academic year. So then during Welcome Week, we distribute hundreds of copies of the winning book to staff, to students and to reading groups in the community so that we all come together for a campus-wide collective community reading experience. Throughout the autumn and winter then we have a series of events with the authors of the books, a big campus book club for all of those who've read it so they can share their thoughts, and our new first year English and creative writing students and our MA in creative writing students will study the Big Read book on one of their modules. So the read along then culminates with an exciting event in late autumn when the winning author joins us on Brunel campus for a live interview and discussion in person. So today I am delighted to be joined by this year's 4 category winners so that they can introduce themselves to the Brunel community. Congratulations to you all for winning in your categories. Today we have Adam S. Leslie, the winner of the fiction category with Lost in the Garden. Sophie Elmhirst, winner of the non-fiction category with Maurice and Maralyn, an extraordinary true story of shipwreck, survival and love. Colin Barrett, winner of the debut fiction category with Wild Houses, and Liz Hyder, winner of the children's fiction with The 12. So to get us started, I'm just going to ask each of the authors to introduce themselves and their work. And maybe Liz, you can kick us off. You're very welcome.
Oh, I was thinking you were going to go for Adam then, because you read his name first. Damn.
Just keeping your toes, Liz.
I'm Liz Hyder. I'm the author of four books to date, 2 for younger readers. So Bearmouth was my debut, which came out in 2019, which is sort of a dystopian thriller set down a working coal mine written in dialect that I made up first person. It's a slightly peculiar book. And then I've written 2 books for grown-ups as well, which are historical fiction with a dash of fantasy. And The 12 is my latest book for young adults, which is won the Nero, which I still can't believe. I'm going to say it again because it makes me excited. Woo! So yeah, The 12 is a time slip adventure, really. And it's set on the wild Welsh coast in the depths of winter, just around winter solstice. On the cusp of sort of a new century, so 1999, just before a new millennium. And there's a girl, Kit, who gets taken on holiday there with her mum and her younger sister, Libby. And on winter solstice, her younger sister disappears, but she doesn't just vanish, she's blinked out of existence. And the only person who remembers her is Kit. And so Kit has to try and work out what happened to see if she can find her sister and restore a sort of a rift in time. And she has to team up with a local boy called Story in order to do so. And so, yeah, she has to find out what the 12 are, for they hold the key. So it's a high stakes kind of, rollicking time slip.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Liz. How about you, Adam? Could you introduce your book to us?
Hi, I'm Adam. My book is Lost in the Garden, which is a folk horror, surreal, dreamlike adventure story and it's set in the wilds of the English countryside in this perpetual summer which has overtaken the country. We don't really know what's caused it, but other strange things are happening too. So there are solid ghosts that are walking around the countryside as well, and geography and generally reality itself is a little bit fluid now. The directions are never quite the same twice when you go down them. So the story involves 3 women, one of whom, Heather, her boyfriend Stephen, has gone to the distant village of Almonby, which is this village they've never been to, and they've been warned since childhood. Don't go to Almonby. So it's like, don't talk to strangers, don't play on the farm, look both ways when you cross the road, and don't go into Almonby. So this is something they've grown up knowing, but this fellow Stephen, he's gone to Almonby. He hasn't said why, just as no one ever says why you shouldn't go to Almonby. It's left as a mystery. But he assures Heather everything's going to be fine. He promises he'll be standing there in front of her in 3 weeks' time, but she's not happy about this at all. So he goes off. 6 months later, she hasn't heard anything from him at all. He's vanished as far as she knows, except she can hear his voice drifting over shortwave radio amongst all the fizzing and the weird noises of shortwave radio, and she can hear him sounding pained and unwell and just saying these random fragments of sentences that don't seem to mean anything. So Heather then realizes that she's got to get a couple of friends to go with her, and they're going to go and find Stephen. But this entails her also going to Almaby, and she's going to find out why they're not supposed to go. So that's essentially the summary.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Adam. Colin, welcome to the Brunel's Big Read. Can you tell us a little bit about Wild Houses and yourself?
Thanks, Helen. So Wild Houses is my first novel. It's my third book. I've written a couple of collections of short stories called Young Skins and Homesickness. And then, as I said, Wild Houses is my debut novel. And like the story collections, it's set in the west of Ireland, in and around County Mayo, where I grew up, and which is all my writing is very informed and rooted in place. Wild Houses itself, the plot kind of pivots around a kidnapping of sorts. A teenage boy named Dal English, who's from a town in Mayo called Ballina, is lifted off the street and brought to a house out in the middle of nowhere, out in the countryside. In that house, we meet one of the two main characters, or one of the two characters from whose perspective the novel unfolds, and that's a young man named Dev Hendrick. Dev is in his 20s. His mother, whom he lived with, recently died, and he sort of just, after her death, he sort of just removed himself from society. He does have a connection to the men who kidnapped Dal, and he has a kind of connection of sorts to Dal, and those connections get teased out over the next few days as Dal is brought to his house, and Dev has no choice but to kind of put him up there. The other character whose viewpoint we follow is a teenage girl named Nikki Hennigan. She lives in Ballina, and she is Dal's girlfriend. At the start of the novel, she's pretty much on the cusp of breaking up with him, but then he goes and gets kidnapped. So she kind of gets dragged into it in the next few days, as this plot unfolds. So the novel really just follows, set over 3 days, over the weekend of the Dal goes missing, and we move between the perspectives of Dev and Nikki as the plot sort of unravels, and that's what that novel's about.
Excellent. Thank you, Colin. I see we've lost Adam, but hopefully he'll pop back up. So we'll just keep going for the moment, and hopefully he'll join us in a second. Next to you, Sophie, you're very welcome. Could you introduce your wonderful book to us, please?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm Sophie Elmhirst. My book is Maurice and Maralyn. And it's the story of Maurice and Maralyn, a true story. They were a couple in the 70s, an English couple who decided to emigrate to New Zealand on a little sailing boat, and they get hit by a whale in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And their boat is shipwrecked, and they're cast adrift for, many weeks, nearly 4 months. And the book just sort of charts this very extreme episode in their lives, but also I think when I came across the story, I was amazed that I sort of hadn't heard of it before, and didn't meet anyone when I started talking about this thing that had happened that I just discovered. Couldn't meet anyone that had heard, that remembered the story. So I was equally intrigued as to what happened to them after an event like this. So the book sort of charts their whole lives. Without giving too much away, they are eventually rescued, but after a kind of, prolonged near-death ordeal in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And they have a sort of brief spurt of fame. They're on TV, they're interviewed, they travel the world, and then they kind of slide into obscurity and stay married. And the book kind of tries to follow as much as possible the sort of progress of their lives and the kind of reverberations of an experience like this, both on them as individuals, but also as a couple. And yeah, I'm a journalist in my sort of day job. So I suppose for me, the kind of writing of this book, the challenge of it and the fun of it was uncovering the story as much as I could. sadly, Maurice and Maralyn are no longer alive, but I was able to sort of track down friends, family, all the media coverage that happened at the time, that of their shipwreck and when they were rescued. And it was sort of piecing the kind of puzzle together, I guess, of the experience in all its extremity, but also in its intimacy of what, the kind of the inner workings, I guess, of a marriage in the most sort of extreme possible circumstances. So yeah, that's the story.
Fascinating, Sophie. Gosh, and all the stories you must have come across as a journalist, this must be really special as the one that,
Yeah.
you opted into. So I can't wait to hear more about it. Thank you. So it would be great if you all would be happy to do a reading for us so that we get a little taste of what the books themselves are like. So if you don't mind, Liz, I'll come back to you to kick us off with the readings, please. That would be great.
I just need to give a bit of context.
Sure.
So this is sort of just a short extract from quite near the start. So Kit's sister has vanished. Even their own mum doesn't believe her that she ever existed, that it's just a weird dream. And because it's 1999 and the internet is in its infancy, so Kit has to go to the sort of nearest little town to try and find out what she can. So she's in the museum, and when she's in there sort of trying to ask questions, trying to ask about the White Tower in which Libby went missing, there's a woman who's sort of overhearing, who she saw earlier on a beach, who wears sort of a boiler suit, and it's just got a very interesting stare. And so Kit comes out of the museum and the woman grabs her. "I couldn't help but overhear, child," she purrs, her voice like honey. "What exactly did you wish to know more about?" I look into her eyes and her pupils aren't right. They shift somehow, almost like a whirlpool, and I have an overwhelming urge to run away from her as fast as I can. "It doesn't matter," I say crisply, trying to shake free, but she doesn't let go. "Tell me," she insists, her voice silky smooth, even as her eyes look wild. "Why did you ask about the White Tower and the darkest day?" "What do you mean?" "Tell me everything, child," she says, her fingers digging in. "What did you see?" "I don't know what you're talking about. Please," I say, hearing the fear in my own voice. "Leave me alone." She releases her grip, but her eyes bore deep into me, dark brown flecked with gold that shimmers and shifts in the sunlight. "I see you are confused, scared," she says, looking at me as if I were a curious plaything. "Then let me help you." "I don't want your help," I say nervously, my heart racing, wanting to get away from this peculiar woman as fast as I can. I rub my arm, sore from where she squeezed it, as I back away from her. "But perhaps you need my help, child." She smiles, her teeth too long somehow, too sharp as she leans towards me, "and perhaps I need yours in return." I turn and march away as fast as I can, but I hear her behind me. "This is no time for games, child," she calls out as I start to run. "Tell me why you seek answers about the White Tower. Tell me the truth." I barely think about where I'm going, only that I need to get away as fast as possible. I run back down the slope to the beach and along past the cliffs, pastel terraces teetering above. But when I glance back, the woman is still behind me, some distance away but following. She walks slowly and steadily like a hunter, taking her time, almost as if she knows it is inevitable she will catch me. And I don't know what makes me do it, but I reach into my pocket and pull out the hagstone I found earlier on the beach, smooth in my palm. I plant my feet firmly in the sand and hold it up, thinking of Libby as I look through it directly at the woman. There's a whistling in my ears, shrill and sharp like the sound of a wasp, but 1,000 times louder. The wind whips my fair hair across my face, but I see it through the hole where the woman was. No woman, but a wolf, wild-eyed, majestic and monstrous. A wolf stares back at me where the woman stood. I hold my breath as the hagstone burns hot in my hand, as if I'd plucked it from a fire, and I drop it with a yell. When I look back up, the woman is still there, motionless. No sign of any wolf. She stares at me, eyes locked, as if she could scent my fear. Time feels like it stretches before finally she turns away, leaving me alone as the wind whips the sand around me into tiny hurricanes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Liz. That was excellent. Adam, over to you. Could we hear a little bit from Lost in the Garden, please?
Certainly can.
Thank you.
All those years of dire whispered warnings, of school assemblies and safety pamphlets and photocopied flyers pushed through the letterbox. Stay away from Almonby. Almonby is dangerous. Go anywhere, but don't go to Almonby. But no one ever specified why. No one thought to impress upon the children exactly what terrible fate would befall them if they did happen to venture across its threshold. It was likely no one actually had any idea. It was simply a fact, Almonby was dangerous. Everyone knew it, even if they couldn't remember how they knew. But there was certainly no need to question it or look into it any further. All anyone was really sure of was that if you went to Almonby, you'd never come back. Curious children probably would have gone. They'd have dared each other, packed sandwiches and chocolate bars and cans of cola and made a day of it. Except no one knew exactly where it was or how to get there. It wasn't within cycling distance, none of the bus routes went near, and there was certainly no one with a car who'd be willing to drive, not even a tearaway older brother full of bravado and cheap lager. And so Almonby remained unexplored, at least by anyone Antonia knew. Philip Swain, who was in their class at school, said his uncle lived in Almonby. He told them sometimes he would visit his uncle on weekends and had to dodge whirlpools and quicksand, and was once chased all the way home from the sweet shop by a deranged wolf. But this was the same boy who liked to boast of his father's daring do as a flight lieutenant in the Royal Air Force, even though everyone knew full well Frank Swain was a milkman. One rainy, overcast afternoon, whilst idly browsing her dad's A to Z roadmap, 11-year-old Antonia Coleridge happened across Almonby, right there, as plain as day, bang in the centre of page 44. She read the word a couple of times just to make sure. Almonby. She spent the rest of the afternoon cross-legged on the floorboards of the spare room, shivers running up and down her back, staring at the name, that innocent-looking black type, Almonby, and at the pale orange Rubik's Cube of buildings, and at the twisty capillary B roads radiating away on all four sides. She couldn't work out exactly how far away it was, just that it was 2 turns of the page distant from Headingham, hardly close at all. Antonia tried to imagine the terrible things that might go on there, but couldn't come up with anything which lived up to the place's reputation. And then she tried to picture what Almonby looked like. No one had ever said. She imagined a putrid medieval hellhole full of witches and gallows and plague. Then she imagined a petrified war zone of rotting concrete and broken windows, all piss and graffiti, with ragged people huddling in doorways and inside the carcasses of burnt-out tower blocks, like she sometimes saw in other countries on the news on TV. Then she imagined a dripping, sprawling, black industrial wasteland which stretched as far as the eye could see, gobbling up unwary souls and spewing chemicals into the atmosphere. It didn't look big enough for that, of course. On the map, it was barely larger than Headingham. Nonetheless, the mere idea of the place gave her the greyest and gloomiest nightmares she'd ever had. They woke her up at 3 a.m. and left her too rattled even to leave her bedroom for a wee. The next time she searched in the A to Z a few weeks later, she couldn't find Almonby at all. It was still listed in the index right at the very top, but when she turned to page 44 and ran her finger along to square 5E, there was no sign of it.
Excellent. Thank you, Adam. Over to you, Colin. Could we hear a little bit from Wild Houses, please?
Sure. So I'm just going to read from the opening of the novel. Dev Hendrick was lying in the dark on the sofa, laptop propped on his belly, asleep or almost asleep. Earbuds bleeding white noise into his ears when his phone buzzed 3 times on the coffee table and stopped. He felt the vibrations more than he heard them. He sat up, snapped shut his laptop and put it on the coffee table. The white noise in his earbuds died. He reached for his phone and knew the number before he even checked the screen. 3 buzzes meant, "We are here." He pulled the buds from his ears, cocked his head to listen into the empty night, and then he heard it. The familiar noise of the car crawling up the drive, the low burr of the engine, the bubble-wrapped crackle of wheels turning slow on gravel. There was a near-empty bottle of Corona on the table. He drank off the dregs. The Corona was flat and citrus sour, a wilted wedge of lime, curled like a drowned bug in the bottom of the bottle. The dog, Georgie, snoozing away on the battered red wingback chair, stirred and came awake with a startled yelp. "Shush now," Dev said. Georgie was a tiny, highly strung dog with a candy floss coat, covering a rib cage as fragilely fine-boned as a chicken's. He had demonic yellow teeth, a wizened, rat-like face, and a moist, bloodshot, perpetually beseeching stare that half the time made Dev want to punt the thing over the garden wall. Not that Georgie ventured outdoors much anymore. Aging, ill-tempered, and increasingly unintrepid, the dog preferred the cosily cluttered terrain of the sitting room, where he spent his days mooching from cushioned niche to niche and staring at the TV like an old woman. Georgie yelped again. "Stop now, will you?" Dev said, raising his voice enough to draw a chastened gurgle from Georgie. Dev and Georgie had never much got on, but ever since the mother died and the dog had come to the realization that Dev was now the sole source of sustenance and what would thereafter pass for companionship available in the house, Georgie had developed, if not an affection, at least a grudging receptivity to Dev's commands, so long as those commands were delivered with sufficient emphasis and contempt. Georgie respected only emphasis and contempt, at least from Dev. Dev slipped on his Crocs and lumbered into the hallway, an icy diagonal of light that pierced the front door's glass panel, illuminating the hall's green and gold wallpaper and the musty foliage of the mother's old overcoats piled up on the coat rack. Dev drew back the latch and opened the door. The sensor light had come on, flooding the drive with brightness. Rain flurried like sparks in the light. Drops touched Dev's face and stuck. The car's engine cut off. The headlights went dark. Dev watched his cousin, Gabe Ferdia, step out of the driver door, and a moment later Gabe's younger brother Sketch stepped out of the back and helped, or rather dragged, a third person out into the drive. The third person was a kid, pale-faced young fella. "Some night for it," Gabe declared. "Are you fucking kidding me?" Dev said. "Afraid not," Gabe said, squinting beleagueredly against the flurrying rain and smiling slyly out of his long, thin face. "You going to let us in or what?" The three stood there in the rain, waiting on Dev. "Come in," Dev said. Sketch shoved the kid in the back to get him moving. He was wearing only one sneaker and carrying the second in his hand, obliging him to hop a little on his socked foot across the drive's stony gravel. When the kid was close enough, Dev could see that his face was marked, dark nick, too fresh to have scabbed, lining the rim of one eye. The boy gazed expressionlessly up at the house, then Dev. "Nah," he said. "Yeah," Gabe said. "No fucking way," the kid said. He stood in place until Sketch shoved him again. The kid stumbled in over the threshold. Sketch and Gabe came in after him. Dev lapsed the door as the brothers marched the kid down the hall. There.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Colin. And Sophie, over to you. We'd love to hear a little bit of Maurice and Maralyn, please.
Sure. This is from a little way in when they're very much adrift. They've been drifting around in the ocean for a couple of weeks by now. There were ways of marking time, of trying to keep a grip on it. They had the sunrise and the sunset and the habits of their pet turtle, who'd pull himself up on the dinghy seat and watch them, wrote Maralyn, with a sorrowful eye. Maralyn had her diary and began to write out a calendar on the canopy of the raft. Significant dates had a circle round them: Easter, Passover, birthdays, a cross when they caught a turtle, a plus sign for the sight of a ship. Maurice had his watch, which he hung from an electric wire on their broken emergency light. Sometimes Maralyn's hair caught on the winder which stopped the watch, and Maurice would have to wait for the sun to reach its zenith before to reset the time. At home, it would be nearly the beginning of spring, Maralyn realised. England would soon be coming into leaf, all that energy turning into green. The country would be soaked by rain. "Sometimes I can smell the English countryside, fresh mown grass, etc.," she wrote in her diary. "I long for greenery and brown earth, plants and trees." When she woke, early in the morning, in the gap between sleep and consciousness where fictions grow, she imagined she was camping in the Lake District. The orange of the raft's canopy was the same colour as their tent, and it wasn't hard to believe, pressed against the warmth of Maurice's body, that they were in their sleeping bags and that beyond the flats of the tent were rising hills, sheep grazing, fields bordered by stone walls. She could almost hear the birds. Compared to land, the palette of the ocean was limited. A sunset could put on a show, striping the sky with fading colour, but mostly both water and sky shifted between greys and blues or the black of night. And the only colour they had on their vessels was a flag that Maurice had made from a pair of orange trousers, which he tied to an oar and attached to the seat in the dinghy. An attempt to make them visible.
Wow, thank you so much, Sophie. Perhaps, I'll come to you to ask you another question while we have you here. I was really interested to read that you came upon Maurice and Maralyn when you were researching about the human desire to escape from our lives. And I just would love to hear what you think you've learned about that desire to flee from having spent so much time with Maurice and Maralyn. Did it?
It's a good question. I think Maurice is a kind of an interesting sort of test case in this, and that he was a man, I think, who was really, to cut to the chase, kind of trying to escape himself. And I think often that urge to escape kind of can be boiled down to that. I researched the story and found the story in the middle of the pandemic, and I ended up writing an article on a sort of related subject about people trying to kind of create autonomous communities out in the ocean and at sea, and people trying to any way they could to sort of live away from land or from sort of conventional living. And it's always intrigued me that kind of pull of wilderness, or of people who want to kind of upturn, I suppose, what sort of the way society maybe expects them to live. And Maurice and Maralyn were both definitely those sorts of people. And I think in her that urge was a sort of thirst for adventure, which I think it can absolutely be the sort of positive form of that, like urge to escape. But Maurice was a troubled guy. He'd had a pretty affectionless upbringing. He was, before he met Maralyn, who was this incredible sort of life force, he had led a pretty lonely, pretty limited existence. And travel and climbing mountains and sailing were all his ways of sort of trying to counter that. But his real craving was solitude, was sort of that real pure solitude. They didn't even take a radio on this journey. So when they were shipwrecked, they had no means of contacting anyone because he wanted this sort of total isolation. And it's something that he has to wrestle with, and really wrestles with right to the sort of depths of sort of human experience when they are sort of stranded in that he can't, despite it almost being the sort of ultimate realization of that escape, he can't escape himself, and he turns on himself very, very brutally. Well, we're in the middle of this their time adrift, and that, to me, that sort of psychological, that sort of desire for psychological escape, I suppose, was a real kind of point of interest for me in the book.
Oh, excellent. That's so fascinating. And I mean, I'm imagining when you embarked on the project, you had an idea in your mind of, what narrative this research would ultimately tell, or that you were expecting the novel to, or the book to take shape within. I mean, did that change a lot by the end of it? Did you realize it was actually a book about something else than what you initially thought it was going to be?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, the journalist in me, the thing that caught my eye was the sort of extremity, was the adventure, was the story in its sort of sort of basic form. But the thing that I knew that meant that sort of made me think it could be a book or could be something more than that was the wholeness of their lives, and the idea that the book wouldn't end with their rescue, that it wasn't just a sort of neat kind of, so they wouldn't have the sort of neat or sort of tidy satisfactions of a kind of narrative in that sense, that it needed to contain a bit more of the mess of life and the and also of not of sort of total absolution, that they would have to face what anyone has to face, or anyone in any kind of relationship has to face, which is their own mortality and the mortality of the person that they love. And so it was very important for me to kind of to get to that point, and was lucky to find a bunch of letters that Maurice had written later in life after Maralyn has died, when he's sort of alone again and in the midst of a very debilitating grief and depression. And it was sort of that phase that kind of completely changed how I thought about the book, and that became just as important to me as the sort of drama of their time adrift in the ocean.
It's amazing, and I think it's something that that sort of being comfortable with the ambivalence of what your narrative is, I think, can be really useful in fiction and non-fiction writing, that you're open to allowing this, the kind of story to evolve away from what you intended it to be. So yeah, I think that translates across to all different forms. Thank you so much, Sophie. Adam, I'd love to talk to you a little bit more about Lost in the Garden. It's been described as folk horror, but I mean, do you feel like it's leaning more heavily on the folk in that than the horror? How do you feel with that as a characterization of the book?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, it's not horror in the Stephen King sense. There's no heads coming off or blood spurting or any of that kind of thing. It's not a particularly violent book, and there's very little bloodshed or anything like that. And it's more about the atmosphere of it. So yeah, it's more the folk, the textures of the unsettling kind of atmosphere as well. Everything's sort of surreal. It's quite dreamlike. So it's constantly wrong-footing you as to actually what the landscape is doing. So it's very rooted in the landscape. And this summer, that's something else with the folk horror. That folk horror is often very autumnal, or it's to do with spring, like the Wicker Man, which is to do with all the renewal of life and that kind of thing. But there's not a lot that intense midsummer. So this is kind of, I'm going in that kind of slot. So there's a lot of nostalgia about ice cream vans and long lost childhood summers and that sort of thing.
Oh, great. You mentioned their long lost childhood. I mean, I'm curious if you think that this novel is somehow responding to, childhood fears you may have had, things that scared you when you were younger, and as an adult, you're getting to respond to those fears and bring them out into the light. Do you think there's anything in that?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I think this childhood and even going all the way up to just being like a young adult. So the characters are in their early to mid 20s, and there are lots of discussions as they get closer to Allenby. So as they are nearing Allenby, it has an effect on the way they think and the sort of thoughts they're expressing to each other. But one of the recurring things is the fact that because they're all so young and they can't, as many people in that kind of age, and I was exactly the same back then, is you can't imagine being middle-aged and old when you're young, and it just seems really weird that one day you'll be old, and particularly like every day you look exactly the same as you did yesterday. So how does that even add up to being this elderly person when I'm so young and beautiful and fit and healthy now? So that's one of the core themes of it as well, is them coming to terms with that, but also being exaggerated by the effect that Allenby is having on them as they are nearing it.
Gosh, so the great fear of becoming middle-aged
I
driving
know.
the narrative forward, I think that's hit us all in a very soft spot. Thank you so much, Adam. And Colin, I'd love to ask you a little bit about Wild Houses, in the sense of it being, of course, your debut novel, but as you mentioned, you published these two incredible short story collections before that got, won loads of awards and have had so much critical acclaim. But can you talk to us a little bit about that transition of moving forward from having written the two short story collections to writing a novel, and what impact that had on your writing practice?
Um, it was hard. It's hard to do. It took a long time to figure it out, Wild Houses is the only novel I've finished. It's the only novel I've written. It took a lot of working. I'd been writing short stories practically exclusively for a good 10 years, I'd say. That was a form I'd fallen in love with, and the form I sort of found my voice in, the short story. And so my whole writing practice was bent towards the curious shapes of that the short story form demands. They're very elusive in some ways, and they're very, with a short story, it's all about a matter of timing, where you begin, where you end. And they pack a lot in. They're very intense. They can take, it's like reducing down a sauce. You put in more and more stuff, trying it down and down and down. Whereas a novel needs to expand, it needs to open up, you bring your characters together. And I started the drafting of Wild Houses with the character of Dev, the guy who answers the door, this young man who lives alone, and it's there's two men there with this who he knows turn out to be his cousins. He's affiliated with them. They're criminals, and they have this young boy with them, this teenage boy who they've kidnapped. And I wrote that. That was the first scene of the novel I wrote. I wrote a version of that probably 6 or 7 years ago when I started it, and I just felt there was something there. It was different to a short story. There was more there in the premise. There was more implicit in it, and I just had a vague sense that it might scale out. But the actual work of doing that is very unglamorous and slow and back and forth. Yourself just writing a novel, getting to the end of something is it took me, the other main character of Nikki, who kind of resides in Ballina. So there's Dev's house, and that's almost like a fixed location, and Doll is brought there, and they never leave that location. But the novel would have been too static and claustrophobic and airless, I think, if it had stayed. I mean, of course, you could write a version of that novel that never leaves the house, but I needed to get back to Ballina, the town that Doll is from, and that Dev has an extensive relationship in, and that Nikki is from. So it took a while to sort of, when I found Nikki, she was always there, but she was a much more minor character in the early drafts. So in the final form, she's as prominent a character as Dev. We see everything that happens in Ballina or outside of Dev's house through her perspective, and so bringing her forth and sort of restructuring the story around that was the key. And that happened several years into writing it, so it's a long process.
Yeah, and I think sometimes people think that writing a novel is just really like writing a really long short story, or the opposite way, a short story is just a really, really shrunken narrative, but they're so completely different forms. So I think it is really challenging to move, from one across to the other. And you mentioned that you were living abroad in Toronto for many years, but your short story collections are all set around Mayo, and the novel's set around Mayo. Do you think that moving abroad gave you perspective that you needed to write it a different way about where you came from? How did it
Yeah,
alter your view of?
probably. I mean, I think it's a function of just leaving a place as well and achieving a perspective on it. So before I lived in Toronto for the last 7 years, or well, up until a year ago, and I did in fact write most of Wild Houses there, to be honest, and some of the stories that were in Homesickness as well. But before that, I'd lived in Dublin, and that's where I wrote Youngskins, my first book. So Dublin is not that far from Ireland, from Ireland, from Mayo. But nonetheless, I sort of, I got out of my small town. Well, I love my small town, but you can have a lot of ambivalent feelings about it, that's an intrinsic part of the love for it. And so leaving it, yeah, it helped me, kind of in my 20s, I knew I wanted to write, and I was searching for what is my topic, what's my subject, how is my writing going to be anything more than sort of just academic exercises or technical exercises. And it probably took me longer than it should have to realize I needed to write about, where I was from, where I grew up. Once I hit on that through fiction, refracted through fiction, my writing to me became alive and vivid in a way. So I'm really lucky that I found my subject, and it hasn't, Mayo has not exhausted itself in my imagination yet.
And that's why I took flight. And I mean, Dublin may be not that far geographically from Mayo, but it is probably quite far spiritually. So I can see why.
That's it, yeah. It's very different. So absolutely get the perspective you need. Absolutely.
Great, thank you, Colin. And just to pick up, Liz, on what Colin's talking about there in terms of finding your subject, I think you're quite obsessed about birds and have had, leaned into some of your obsessions in your writing. And I think there's something really beautiful in that, in terms of people feeling empowered to write about the things that they are really obsessed by and the things that they love by. And is that something that you would encourage writers to do, to lean into their own particular interests, and that's the kind of thing that can unlock something for you, to find what's uniquely yours to write about?
I think you've just got to find the thing that you feel passionate about, and it's got to fit with that, really. So, I mean, in my first book, the one that was set down the coal mine, I'm quite scared of most things. So I'm scared of the dark and small spaces and being underground. So that was not fun to research, really. I'm hoping Sophie didn't go out on a raft for a month to kind of, for immersive research. But yeah, no, I mean, I'm interested in lots of things. I am basically an unashamed nerd. I'm really interested in kind of folklore, and, like with Adam and the folk horror, there's definitely sort of elements of that in the 12, like with sort of stone circles, and that being kind of a key to the sort of time slips. But like Colin as well, like the sense of place for me is kind of a really key thing. It's like, I think what I'm increasingly drawn to writing is stories that are really rooted somewhere. My friend does, she calls it placemaking theatre, what used to be called an old money site-specific theatre. And I think that's what I'm sort of trying to do with books, that I find a location that kind of sings to me, almost like a tuning fork, kind of, there's something here, and then I have to go back and kind of unearth it. But yeah, no, I did indulge myself. I'm a bit of a bird nerd, but I really like, I'm really interested in astronomy, and I'm very interested in sort of really sort of deep past, ancient history, wildlife in general. So yeah, I did pour all of that into my characters and some of the storytelling in the 12. Yeah, I mean, if you've got it, if there's something that's the thing, it's got to be about passion. I think what's the story that you want to tell, and how do you want to tell it? And if you can sneak things that you really care about in there as well, then all to the good.
Excellent. And I mean, you mentioned that you write between writing for young adult readers, younger readers, and adult. I think it'd be really interesting for listeners to understand a bit about moving between those two and how you fix upon, in particular, the tone of voice that's appropriate for younger readers. Do you have rules of engagement for yourself that means that you know you're firmly within, that category and that it's not slipping into being too adult, too adult? How do you navigate that, when you're working on your younger books?
I sort of don't really, actually, is the sort of simple answer. I think I've written a lot of books that didn't get published. I'm very jealous of Colin's, this being the first novel that he's finished. So my first novel that I finished and my first 6 novels that I finished never got published. All's the greater good, I say. They are in a bin. They're not in the drawer anywhere, they're just in a bin. So Bearmouth was my 7th book, but the first one to get published. And I think that's really important to say as well. I think it's really important to say, like, how long it can take to find your voice, to find what you feel passionate about. Like Colin was saying, like, what do I want to say and how do I want to say it? And that can take as long as it takes. But yeah, for me, the difference between writing for sort of younger readers and older readers is just what's the story and how do I want to write it, and that kind of informs really who it's for. I mean, I don't tend to swear so much in my younger readers' books. I don't swear in my adult books that much, actually, either. But so there is an element of language, but I don't patronise and I don't talk down. And the sort of books that I really loved as a kid, like Alan Garner and like Susan Cooper, and so many of those kind of sort of folklore-y fairy tale books, they don't talk down to you as a reader. They sort of expect you to kind of keep up, really. So I guess, yeah, that's what I try and do, but no swearing.
Okay, great. And as I mentioned, the big read winner will be studied by students on our BA in English and Creative Writing degree and on the MA in Creative Writing degree. And so maybe as a last question, I'd love to ask each of you how you feel about your book being part of a university curriculum and the thoughts of students reading it and analysing it and discussing it at great length. And if there's something that you hope that they will take away from the experience of reading the book, and not just them really, like all readers, but something that you hope that someone who would spend time with your book reading it in a deep way would take away from it. Maybe Adam, would you care to kick us off with that?
Yeah, I think it's very exciting, the thought of it. It's slightly mind-boggling in a way, because like everyone, you have your little space and you just set off writing this book, and you don't know, you have no idea what's going to happen to it when it's published. And this is sort of my debut. I had a couple of others published a little while ago for a tiny press that didn't, sold 100 copies each and quickly went out of print, and I don't really count that. But this is sort of effectively my debut novel, and so it's quite a mind-boggling idea that people could actually be studying it and looking at it in depth. A little bit of an out-of-body experience almost, I think. But what they might get out of it, I'm very keen on escapism and being transportative and taking people into not to another world, but to like another environment and another texture or another atmosphere, building a particular atmosphere and a tone to it, that people can be inside. It's somewhere that you're looking forward to get back to the novels. You can be back in this place and back inside this environment and this story. So that's the main thing for me, is just to take people out of their real lives and their everyday lives and into this strange environment.
Great, thank you, Adam. I don't think we ever needed escapism more from the real world. So yeah, that sounds good. Thank you. And how about you, Sophie? How do you feel about it?
Oh, it's an extraordinary thought. I hope there's enough in there to keep them going. But it's an amazing thought to I've spent many years I guess reading and trying to learn from writers I admire, and so the idea that it could furnish anyone with some inspiration is a really a lovely thing. In terms of what I hope people might take from it, I suppose something that was important to me to try and do. I'm more of in a way, a reader of fiction than I am of nonfiction, even though I'm a journalist as my job, but was just the idea that there could be other ways of writing nonfiction. I hope to write about real people and true events in a way that was sort of compelling, and that where the attention was sort of trained on people, and on the sort of motivations and sort of workings of people, and how we are with each other and how we depend on each other. And I don't know, I suppose the idea that you could have a kind of maybe more sort of humanist approach to like non-fiction writing, or different ways of sort of approaching the world. I think non-fiction can sometimes be off-putting to certain kinds of readers, as what they think it's sort of dry or academic, or sort of straight biography or straight history, or but that there are ways of sort of reporting and recording the world as it is, which hopefully kind of can also sort of offer some of the pleasures of fiction. And that was certainly what I was hopefully trying to kind of pull off. But they can be the judge of that.
Excellent. And I think one of the modules that we do on our MA here is in creative nonfiction, where we explore all of these things about approaching nonfiction writing in creative ways. So I think that really speaks to a lot of the work that we're doing. So that's great. Thank you so much, Sophie. How about you, Colin? How do you feel about being on the syllabus and the students doing a deep dive into your characters?
God almighty, a crash course in Mayo, yeah. I mean, I'm very grateful and very, very, it's still a novel idea to me that, people I've never met, strangers, are out there reading my books and appreciating them. So, it's really great. And, I hope that, I just hope that the students who get to read it can find something in it that they recognize. I mean, it's a plot about there's a kidnapping and stuff, and probably not too many people have direct experience of that. But my characters are often a little bit, most of them are on the younger side, and they tend to be a little bit at a crossroads in their life, and maybe a little bit adrift and unsure as to where to go next. I mean, I remember when I was a student. I mean, I found college difficult. I was quite lost in it, really, to be honest. And but I loved reading. I loved literature, and when I went to the UCD library, and I would spend afternoons there reading, you would find connection and find a voice, maybe from a very long time ago or from a very different place, and it's somehow you recognize it, So I think that's hopefully, if my books can instill a little bit of that similar type of feeling or resonance with a reader, I'd be very delighted.
Well, that's lovely. I mean, I think something I say to our students a lot is that if they're feeling lost what they're looking for, they probably won't find it in a screen, but they might find it in the library. So I think, that would be an amazing thing for them all to read all of your books and feel more connected to the world and see a way forward. That's amazing. How about you, Liz? How are you feeling about all of this?
It sort of slightly blows my mind. I mean, like Colin was saying, it's that thing of, it is, we do spend so much time on our own, sort of sitting in our imagination and then writing things down, and it is sort of the ultimate magic trick, I think, really, that you can write things down with some little letters, and then those letters form words, and then somehow I transfer what I've been feeling and thinking into your head via those characters written down on a page, and in those characters you can tell any story that's ever been written. I think that's kind of, it is like thought transference. Maybe Adam, you could maybe that's an Adam's book, which I'm very excited to read. But there is something really powerful about that. Stories are really powerful, and I think sometimes we forget that, and it's easy to despair about those things. But stories are incredibly powerful. I mean, I don't want to mention the Orange Man in America at the moment, but I do believe that the reason that he was voted in was because he told a more compelling story. It was short and it was simple and it was easy to understand and it was emotive. And that's still storytelling. It's different from the story that I tell about stone circles and time slips. But I think stories are incredibly powerful, and we can really see that at the moment in terms of world politics. And I hope that that's what people take away from my book as well, is that, stories are powerful, but also hope is powerful, because hope means that you can be spurred on to do something, whereas if you just feel hopeless, you become passive, you don't do anything, whereas hope can kind of drive you forward. And so that's kind of a key idea in my book. But also, there is something special about children's books. It's a real kind of privilege to kind of get to write for younger readers, because they're the books that I think stay with us in a lifetime. It's like you're kind of somehow injected into the veins of people, and like decades later, they can still remember. If you say, what were your 3 favourite books when you were growing up? They'll go, oh, I don't know if I can name 3. You know, there is something very powerful about those stories that are kind of lodged into you when you're very young. And it's a really interesting thing to kind of get to write for younger readers for that reason, really, as well. So yeah, but yeah, it blows my mind, the idea that someone would study it. That's kind of wild.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Liz. And thank you to all of you, to Colin and Sophie and Adam, for all being here to join with us today. We will have longer interviews with each of you individually in the autumn, of course, when the activities all start happening around the big read. But for now, we just want to wish you all the very best of luck with the overall Nero Gold Award winner announcement on March 5th. We're rooting for you all, so I hope you all win. Just to encourage everyone to seek out your books, you know, in your local booksellers, go to your local library and read along with us as we're going through this campaign. And keep an eye out for those events, because they will be live and open to everybody to join us. But for the moment, we will leave it there and encourage all of our students to get voting now for which one of these 4 fabulous books that they would like to vote as the big read in the autumn. So thank you all so much for watching, and thank you again to Liz and Colin and Sophie and Adam for being with us and for your wonderful books. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye bye.